Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something really fundamental, I think, to how we all see the social world around us. Stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. They're everywhere, aren't they?
They really are. We bump into them constantly. They shape us, often in ways we don't even consciously notice, but they're powerful.
Absolutely. You can think of a stereotype as sort of a mental shortcut, maybe. A generalization we make about a whole group of people.
Based on what, though? Just belonging to the group? Or maybe physical traits?
Both, yeah.
Ah.
And these generalizations, they can seem positive, like thinking a certain group is just naturally talented at something specific.
Or they can be negative, like those awful generalizations about driving ability or things like that.
Exactly. And our source material today, it really links this back to basic cognitive stuff. How we categorize people, how our brains build schemas or frameworks to make sense of things quickly.
Okay, right. So our brains like to categorize. That makes sense for efficiency. But that doesn't quite explain where the content of those stereotypes comes from, does it? Why these specific ideas get attached to those specific groups.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's really what we want to unpack today. Using our source, let's dig into how they actually form and maybe more importantly, how they affect us, both the people holding them and, well, the people being stereotyped.
Sounds good. So where do we start with formation? If categorization itself isn't the full story.
Well, the idea of social categorization, you mentioned Toshville earlier, that's definitely part of it. We naturally group people. Toshville also noted we tend to see folks in outgroups, groups we don't belong to, as being much more similar to each other than they really are.
Outgroup homogeneity, right, like they're all the same.
Precisely. But, like you said, that still doesn't explain the content. Why that specific trait?
So how do those characteristics get assigned?
Okay, so Schneider, writing a bit later, suggested two main ways this happens. One is, let's say, indirect.
Indirect, meaning?
Meaning, we just sort of absorb them from our culture, from media, from what we hear around us, maybe from family. It's like osmosis sometimes.
Okay, that makes sense. The background noise. What's the other way?
The other is direct, stemming from our own personal experiences with individuals from a particular group.
Right. So you have a bad encounter with one person, and maybe, unfairly, you start thinking the whole group is like that.
Exactly. And Campbell back in '67 talked about this too. He pointed to personal experience as one key source. This is where that sometimes problematic grain of truth idea comes from.
The grain of truth, meaning you generalize one maybe true observation about an individual to the entire group.
Yeah, potentially. But Campbell also stressed the huge role of what he called gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers like the media, parents.
Exactly. Media, parents, the broader culture, they shape and pass on these ideas.
Okay, but sometimes these stereotypes seem to pop up even without that direct experience or even a clear cultural message. How does that happen? Our source mentions something called illusory correlations.
Ah, yes. Hamilton and Gifford's work. This is really fascinating stuff. It suggests our brains can basically invent a relationship between two things when one doesn't actually exist.
Invent a relationship, like between a group and a certain behavior.
Precisely. We perceive a link, say, between a minority group and negative behavior, even if statistically there's no basis for it. We just think we see it more often than we actually do.
So our pattern-seeking brain messes up sometimes, creates a false link. The source calls this a cognitive bias, right? Like a thinking error.
Exactly. It's an error in judgment driven by how our minds process information. Attribution errors are another example of these kinds of biases.
And Hamilton and Gifford actually showed this happening.
They did, with a clever experiment. They had participants read statements about two made-up groups, Group A and Group B. Group A was the majority, Group B the minority.
Okay.
And crucially, the researchers made sure the proportion of positive and negative statements was exactly the same for both groups. So objectively, neither group was more negative.
But that's not what people remembered.
Nope. Participants consistently overestimated the number of negative behaviors associated with the minority group, Group B.
Why? Why the minority group?
The thinking is negative behaviors are generally less common than positive ones. So when a member of a smaller, distinct group performs a negative action, it stands out more. It's more memorable, more distinctive.
And because it stands out, people mistakenly think it's more representative of that whole smaller group.
That seems to be the mechanism. It gets overweighted in our memory.
Wow. That sheds some light on why minority groups might often face more negative stereotypes. It also makes sense why, as the source notes, there's debate about reporting ethnicity in crime reports in some places.
It's a real concern. And once these stereotypes form, whether through illusory correlations or other means, They're surprisingly hard to shake.
Because of confirmation bias?
Exactly. Confirmation bias kicks in. We tend to look for and remember information that fits our existing beliefs.
And ignore or downplay stuff that contradicts them.
Right, so if you hold a stereotype, you're more likely to notice examples that seem to confirm it, reinforcing the belief. It's a feedback loop.
And this can even shape our interactions, can it? Like that Snyder and Swan study.
Oh yeah, the self-fulfilling prophecy one. Great example. They told female students they were about to meet either an introvert or an extrovert.
And ask them to prepare questions.
Right, and guess what? The questions they came up with were designed to confirm the label they'd been given.
So if they expected an introvert, they'd ask things like, what don't you like about big parties?
Exactly. Questions that would naturally lead the other person to talk in ways that sounded introverted. The expectation literally created the behavior, confirming the stereotype in the process.
That's quite unsettling. Our expectations can actually make stereotypes come true in a way.
It seems so, but it's not just individual cognition. There's a big social element, too. We often adopt stereotypes just by conforming to our own group's views about another group.
Fitting in, basically. Learning the US versus them attitudes.
The source mentions a study in Rhodesia, Rogers in France.
Yes, back in 1962, they studied white immigrants who had moved to Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. They found a correlation
Between what?
between how long the immigrants had lived there and how prejudiced they were towards the local black population. The longer they stayed, the more prejudiced they tended to be.
And the interpretation was?
Rogers and friends argued this was because they were assimilating, adopting the dominant social norms and attitudes of the existing white community there. Learning the prejudice, essentially.
That's a powerful demonstration of social influence. Though, as the source rightly notes, it was cross-sectional, a snapshot. It didn't track the same people over time.
True, a limitation to keep in mind. But it still strongly suggests that conforming to in-group norms plays a big role in how stereotypes are maintained and spread.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about how these things develop: categorization, faulty correlations, culture, experience, confirmation bias, social conformity. Quite a mix.
Complex, definitely. Now let's shift gears a bit. How do these stereotypes actually affect people? What are the consequences?
Right, because they're not just abstract ideas, they have real impacts. Our source focuses on two major effects. One is called stereotype threat.
Stereotype threat. Okay, what is that exactly?
It's basically the fear or anxiety someone feels when they're in a situation where they could be judged based on a negative stereotype about their group, or even the fear that they might accidentally confirm that stereotype themselves.
So the worry itself gets in the way.
Precisely. That anxiety can actually disrupt their performance in that specific situation.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, the classic study is by Steele and Aronson from 1995. They gave a tough verbal test to black and white university students.
Okay.
For some students, they described the test as being diagnostic of their actual verbal abilities. For others, they said it was just a non-evaluative problem-solving task.
And the results?
When it was framed as a real test of ability, activating the negative stereotype about black students' verbal skills, the black students performed significantly worse than the white students.
But when it wasn't framed that way...
The performance gap basically vanished. Same test, different framing, different results.
That is remarkable. It wasn't about ability, but about the pressure of the stereotype itself.
Exactly. They even found that just asking students to indicate their race on a pretest questionnaire was enough to trigger this effect and lower scores for black students.
Wow. So you don't even have to believe the stereotype yourself.
Apparently not. Steele and Aronson called it spotlight anxiety. The stress and cognitive load of being under the spotlight of a negative stereotype interferes with performance. The implications for things like standardized testing and education are huge.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about race, is it? I think the source mentioned a study on women and math.
Yes, Spencer and colleagues in 1999. They looked at the stereotype that women aren't as good at math as men.
What did they do?
They gave a difficult math test to male and female students who were all selected because they were strong math students equally qualified.
And the outcome?
Just as predicted. The women significantly underperformed compared to the men, but only when the test was difficult and the stereotype was likely salient. When the stereotype wasn't relevant, their performance was equal.
So, again, the threat of the stereotype seemed to hinder the performance of capable individuals.
It seems so. And it even extends to other domains, like sports. There was a study by Stone in 2002 using a golf task.
Golf. How did stereotypes play into that?
It depended on how the task was framed.
Mm.
When it was described as testing natural athletic ability, a domain where white athletes might feel negatively stereotyped compared to black athletes, the white participants actually practiced less.
Interesting. Almost like self-handicapping.
Could be. And conversely, when the same task was framed as testing sports intelligence, where a negative stereotype might apply to black athletes, the black participants performed worse.
So depending on the specific stereotype activated by the situation, different groups can be affected. It really highlights how pervasive this is.
It really does. It can lead to reduced effort, anxiety, all sorts of things that get in the way of showing what you can actually do.
We've talked a lot about negative stereotypes. But what about seemingly positive ones, like, Asians are good at math, or other supposedly good stereotypes mentioned in the source? Are they harmless?
That's a great question. And the short answer is probably not harmless. Even positive stereotypes can be limiting.
How so?
Well, they can create immense pressure to live up to that expectation. What if you don't fit the mold? Plus, they can mask prejudice. Sometimes positive stereotypes are used to justify negative ones about the same group or negative treatment of other groups. They still pigeonhole people and prevent us from seeing individuals as individuals.
Right. It's still putting people in a box, even if the box looks superficially nice. Okay, so stereotype threat impacts performance. What was the other major effect mentioned?
Memory distortion. Stereotypes can actually change how we remember things.
Change our memories. How does that work?
There's a study by Martin and Halverson from 1983 with young children. They showed kids pictures of other children doing activities. Some pictures showed activities consistent with traditional gender roles, like a boy playing with a truck. Others showed inconsistent activities, like a girl sawing wood.
Okay, and then they tested their memory.
Yeah, a week later. The kids were pretty good at remembering the gender-consistent pictures accurately, but for the gender-inconsistent ones, their memories often shifted.
Shifted how?
They might remember seeing a boy playing with a doll when the picture actually showed a girl, or vice versa. Their existing gender stereotypes basically distorted their recall to make it fit the schema.
So the stereotype acted like a filter, changing the memory to fit the expectation. That's powerful. What about that older study, Allport and Postman, the one with the drawing?
Ah, the razor study from 1947. Yes, a classic, though we have to consider its age. They showed participants a drawing often depicted as a white man with a razor arguing with an unarmed black man on a subway.
And then they had people describe it.
Using serial reproduction, one person describes it to the next, and so on. In a significant number of cases, as the story got passed along, the razor somehow ended up in the black man's hand.
So people's memories, or at least their retelling, shifted to align with the prevailing racial stereotypes of the time.
That was the interpretation. It suggested stereotypes were actively shaping how the scene was perceived and remembered.
The source asks if that's still relevant today. Is there more recent research on this kind of bias affecting perception and memory?
Unfortunately, yes. Payne's 2001 study is a key example. Participants were very quickly shown either a black face or a white face, immediately followed by an image of either a tool or a handgun. They had to rapidly identify the object.
What did Payne find?
Even among participants who didn't show high levels of explicit prejudice, being primed with a black face led them to be faster at identifying guns, and also more likely to misidentify a tool as a gun.
So the mere association, the stereotype linking black men with danger or weapons, unconsciously influenced their perception in that split second.
That's the conclusion. It suggests stereotypes operate at a very fast, almost automatic level, affecting not just memory but basic perception. And other studies have found similar effects, like the race of a suspect influencing eyewitness memory of whether a weapon was present.
That is incredibly sobering. The real-world consequences, especially in law enforcement or legal settings, are just enormous.
Absolutely. These aren't just academic concepts. They have profound, sometimes dangerous, real-world impacts.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. Stereotypes form through, well, a whole host of ways. Our basic need to categorize, these illusory correlations where we see links that aren't there.
The things we absorb from culture and gatekeepers, our own experiences sometimes overgeneralized, and then confirmation bias locking them in place.
Plus conforming to what our own group believes. And the impact. It's significant. We see stereotype threat messing with performance in everything from tests to sports.
And memory distortion, where stereotypes literally filter or even change how we perceive and recall events and people.
It's clear these mental shortcuts, while maybe cognitively efficient in some ways, come with some serious downsides.
Definitely. They simplify, but they also distort reality.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Knowing how these biases often work unconsciously, under the radar, where might subtle stereotypes be influencing your own perceptions, your judgments, your decisions day to day? And what could the ripple effects of that be, not just for you, but for society?
Yeah, that's definitely worth considering.